Hey, stay right there. Step away from the house, now.
Officer, this is my property. What's the issue?
You're being detained. We got a call. Suspicious activity.
Suspicious? I'm watering my lawn. You need a warrant to detain me.
Watch your tone. Put your hands where I can see.
I am a civil rights attorney. You are
Turn
violating
around.
the law
Hands
right
behind
now.
your back, now.
The sun had barely climbed over the suburban rooftops when the screech of tires cut through the quiet morning. Jamal Everett, a well-respected civil rights attorney, was watering his garden, humming softly to himself, when a black and white patrol car slid to a stop across his driveway. Within seconds, two uniformed officers stepped out, their boots crunching over the gravel. Jamal froze. He knew his rights, he knew the law. Yet a pit of unease formed in his stomach. One officer, a tall man with a tight jaw and piercing eyes, started walking toward him without saying a word. "Morning, sir," Jamal said cautiously, holding up his hands, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. The officer didn't respond with courtesy. "Stay where you are," he barked. "Step away from the house." Jamal's mind raced. He had lived here for 10 years. This was his property. He had worked decades to build a life in this neighborhood. And yet here was a stranger in a uniform ordering him off his own driveway. Before he could speak, the second officer circled his car, peering inside, rifling through items, tossing a water bottle to the ground. Jamal's heart hammered. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Not to a lawyer who spent his career defending people from exactly this type of abuse. But here it was, raw and unfiltered. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Neighbors peeked through blinds, some whispering, others frozen in disbelief. Jamal's phone was in his pocket, recording silently, because he had learned long ago that documentation could be the difference between justice and silence. "Sir," the tall officer barked again, "you're under detainment until we figure out what's going on." "What's going on?" Jamal's voice rose, calm but steely. "I'm standing on my own property. You need a warrant to detain me." The officer's eyes narrowed. "We received a call about suspicious activity. That gives us reason to investigate." Jamal's fists clenched. Racial undertones were heavy in the words and the way the officer's gaze lingered. He could feel the decades of systemic bias pressing down on him in a way only someone like him, someone black and in the wrong place at the wrong time, could feel. This wasn't just about law anymore. This was about power, about who gets to exist without fear in spaces they own. The second officer, younger, twitchy, seemed uncomfortable but unwilling to defy protocol. "Sir, please cooperate," he muttered, glancing at his partner. Jamal shook his head. "I will cooperate, but I will not be humiliated on my own driveway. You're detaining me illegally." The tall officer stepped closer. "Watch your tone, lawyer. You don't run this interaction." Jamal felt a flash of anger, sharp as a knife. He had spent years defending people from the exact situation he now faced. And yet the roles were reversed. Here he was, a man trained in law, treated like a criminal stripped of agency on land he owned. The quiet hum of suburban life continued around them, as if the world refused to notice what was happening. A neighbor in a bathrobe whispered to another, "Is that his house?" "Yes, that's Mr. Everett." Even in that moment, the officers seemed unaware or unconcerned about the weight of history pressing down in the interaction. One man, black, educated, a defender of rights, confronted by two men in uniform who saw him as a threat simply because of the color of the skin. Jamal's phone vibrated in his pocket, an urgent message from a colleague warning him to stay calm, keep evidence, and not escalate. But calm felt impossible. The tall officer's hand hovered near his belt, fingers brushing the edge of his holster. Jamal met his gaze steadily. The unspoken tension screamed louder than any words. Every second stretched, taut with potential violence. The younger officer shifted, eyes darting nervously, sensing that something could snap at any moment. And then finally, Jamal made a decision. He would not comply with fear. He raised his hands again, phone out, recording everything. "Do what you have to do," Jamal said, his voice steady, tinged with fury. "But know this, I will not be intimidated on my property. You're acting outside the law." The tall officer paused, jaw tight, as if Jamal's calm defiance unsettled him more than any physical resistance could. They stood there for minutes, a silent standoff, until finally, the officer barked an order and handcuffs clicked. Neighbors gasped. Some pulled out their phones. Jamal's heart raced, but he kept recording, knowing the proof mattered more than the fear. This was not the first time he had seen injustice, but it was the first time it had visited him at home, in broad daylight, on a sunny morning, with no reason beyond suspicion, bias, and assumption. As he was led to the patrol car, Jamal looked around at the neighborhood that had accepted him. The trees he had planted, the lawn he had tended. Everything familiar had turned into a stage for humiliation and racial prejudice. And yet, in that moment, Jamal felt a strange clarity. This encounter would not end quietly. It would not vanish. This was the kind of event that changed people, and he was going to make sure it changed the system too. Before we continue, I want to ask, where are you watching from right now? And if you're following this story, please consider subscribing. Your support keeps stories like this alive and urgent. The handcuffs tightened, but Jamal's resolve only grew stronger. He knew this was the beginning of a battle far bigger than one driveway. A fight for justice, recognition, and accountability was about to unfold. By the time Jamal Everett sat in the holding cell, the Florida sun had climbed high, turning the air outside heavy and oppressive. The metal bench beneath him was cold, the walls closed and suffocating. But Jamal's mind was sharp, firing in rapid, precise bursts. He had been through courtrooms, hearings, and fights for civil rights. But never like this, detained on his own property, humiliated before neighbors, and treated like a criminal with no cause. Minutes felt like hours. His phone, confiscated upon entry, was out of reach, cutting him off from the outside world. He could hear the muffled voices of other detainees, the clanging of doors, the occasional shout. Every sound was a reminder. He was being subjected to a system he knew inside out, yet now powerless in its machinery. Detective Paul Mercer, the tall officer from the driveway, entered the room. His eyes were steely, but there was an edge of unease, a flicker Jamal noticed immediately. "Everett," Mercer said, voice sharp. "You need to answer a few questions." "I've answered everything I need to outside," Jamal replied evenly. "I was on my property. You had no warrant. You detained me illegally. I suggest you read your own procedures before wasting more time." Mercer's jaw tightened. "We had a call about suspicious activity. That's enough to investigate." Jamal leaned forward, his hands folded. "Suspicious activity?" His tone was icy, but controlled. "Do you realize how that sounds? A man walking on his own driveway, watering his plants, suddenly becomes a threat because of the color of his skin. That is the reality here. You aren't investigating. I'm the victim. And this isn't a fluke. It's a pattern you refuse to acknowledge." The room fell silent, the words hanging like smoke. Mercer's partner, Officer Kevin Sanderson, shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't the aggressor, but he had followed orders. And now the tension between loyalty to authority and awareness of wrongdoing was palpable. By late afternoon, Jamal was released. The damage was done. News of the detainment had already started spreading through social media, sparked by neighbors who had witnessed the incident and recorded parts of it. Within hours, local news outlets had picked up the story. A black civil rights attorney detained on his own property in a Florida suburb, officers citing suspicious activity. Calls from colleagues, activists, and reporters flooded Jamal's phone. Every notification was a reminder. This was no longer just about him. This was bigger. This was about the thousands of people who faced the same indignities every day. People whose rights were disregarded, whose humanity was questioned because of the color of their skin. Jamal contacted his law firm immediately. His team began preparing for the inevitable legal battle. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about sending a message that abuse of power, bias, and racial profiling would not go unanswered. Within days, Jamal filed a civil rights lawsuit against the city and the officers involved. The complaint was detailed, precise, and damning. Illegal detainment, racial profiling, emotional distress, and violation of constitutional rights. The officer's report, carefully reviewed, contained inconsistencies that Jamal's team would later use to dismantle their credibility in court. The lawsuit ignited a firestorm of debate in local politics. Community meetings filled with residents demanding accountability. Editorials in newspapers criticized the police department's lack of training on racial bias. Social media amplified the story nationwide, with hashtags demanding justice for Jamal and exposing the wider issue of systemic racism in law enforcement. The tension between the community and the police department escalated. Internal investigations were launched, public statements issued, but the damage to the department's reputation had already taken hold. Citizens, activists, and civil rights groups joined forces to call for reform. Jamal's case became a symbol, a real-life example of what it meant to be black and assumed guilty in a society that often ignored history and humanity. Court dates loomed, but Jamal wasn't daunted. He spent nights poring over police reports, reviewing videos, interviewing witnesses, and preparing his testimony. Every interaction, every detainment, every law he had studied for decades became ammunition for the courtroom battle ahead. Mercer and Sanderson, on the other hand, began to feel the pressure. Internal reviews scrutinized their actions. Officers who once treated Jamal with condescension now received constant reminders that the law was being watched, and that accountability was inevitable. Rumors circulated that their careers could be in jeopardy. The courtroom itself became a stage for confrontation, though the real fight was psychological. Jamal was calm, measured, a stark contrast to the officers who had acted with unrestrained authority. His opening statements were precise. He painted a vivid picture of that morning, the driveway, the officers, the fear, the humiliation. He made the jury feel the tension, understand the racial undertones, and see that this was not a case of random error. The defense tried to argue procedure, citing the suspicious activity call, but Jamal dismantled each point methodically, showing inconsistencies, highlighting bias, and presenting neighbor testimonies and recordings from the scene. Every word he spoke reinforced a larger truth, that racial profiling wasn't just a statistic. It was a lived reality, and it had happened to him, a man trained to fight against it. Media coverage intensified. Interviews, news segments, social media debates, all centered on the paradox. A lawyer who defended rights, detained on suspicion alone, with racial undertones impossible to ignore. Public support poured in. Local activists organized rallies. Some critics argued Jamal was exaggerating, but overwhelming evidence made skepticism hard to sustain. Inside the courtroom, every glance from Mercer carried tension. He had underestimated Jamal's resilience and ability to translate personal trauma into legal power. Anderson, quieter but equally implicated, struggled with the realization that obedience to authority had consequences beyond personal accountability. By the end of the first week of the trial, the courtroom had become electric. Every day brought new revelations. Emails revealing officer bias, text messages showing assumptions based on skin color, and eyewitness testimony from neighbors confirming Jamal's account. Jamal's strategy was clear. Make the jury, the city, and the public see that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was systemic. It was personal, yet emblematic of a larger struggle for justice. As the sun set on the courthouse each evening, Jamal walked out with his head high, exhausted but unwavering. He knew the fight ahead was long, but he also knew that detainment on his own property would not define him. He would define the outcome, and justice, both personal and symbolic, was within reach. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with whispers and cameras, a charged atmosphere that made every sound echo. Jamal Everett sat at the front, calm on the outside, nerves tight like wires underneath. He had prepared for this battle for weeks, but nothing could have fully braced him for the energy in the room now. Reporters, activists, and neighbors all crowded in, watching history unfold. Detective Paul Mercer and Officer Kevin Sanderson were seated at the defense table, their faces taut with tension. They'd avoided eye contact with Jamal, but he could feel their unease from across the room. Every flicker of movement, every nervous glance was amplified under the intense gaze of the jury. The first witness called was a neighbor, an elderly woman named Evelyn Harper. She had watched the entire incident from her window and was hesitant at first. But under Jamal's careful questioning, her testimony rang clear. I saw the officers approach Mr. Everett's driveway, she said. He was outside, watering his plants. They didn't ask anything before they started yelling at him. I've never seen anything like it. Mercer shifted in his seat. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Jamal's eyes never left him. He could feel the shift in the room. The jury was already beginning to sense the imbalance of power, the injustice in plain sight. Jamal's voice rose slightly, commanding attention without raising anger. And did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Everett's behavior? He asked. No, nothing. He was just living his morning, Evelyn replied. It was simple, clear, devastating. Jamal didn't need to embellish. The truth was already striking like a hammer. The next piece of evidence was the officer's own body camera footage. Mercer had insisted it showed them acting appropriately, but when projected on the big screen, every nuance became undeniable. The footage revealed unnecessary aggression, commanding language, and a persistent sense of suspicion aimed solely at Jamal, who remained calm and cooperative throughout. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even the defense's attorney couldn't deny what everyone could see, A man on his own property being treated like a criminal because of his race. The racial undertones in the interactions were impossible to ignore. Mercer barked commands while his partner fidgeted nervously. Jamal's calm demeanor contrasted starkly against their assumptions and bias. The jury saw it all, every glance, every gesture, every subtle escalation. Then came the testimony that truly shocked the courtroom. Jamal's legal assistant, an African-American woman named Nina Wallace, testified about the internal communications among the officers. I reviewed their emails and text, she said, holding up printed copies. There are comments here, assumptions made before they even arrived. One message called him a suspicious homeowner, which is exactly what led to the detainment. The courtroom gasped. Mercer's face drained of color. Sanderson shifted uncomfortably. The defense tried to object, claiming it was prejudicial, but the judge overruled them. The jury could see the bias documented in writing, and that evidence was impossible to ignore. Jamal leaned back slightly, keeping his voice calm, but the intensity behind it was sharp. Stowe, he said, the suspicion that led to my detainment wasn't based on anything I did correct. It was based solely on assumption, on perception of my skin color. That is not law enforcement. It's discrimination. The defense sputtered, trying to salvage credibility, but the narrative had already taken hold. Every detail, every witness, every piece of evidence was aligning to tell the truth that had been hidden behind uniformed authority. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy continued. Clips of the incident, the testimony, and the damning footage went viral. Social media lit up with outrage, support, and debates, but one thing was clear. Jamal's story had captured national attention. The injustice wasn't just local, it was symbolic of a systemic problem, and people were paying attention. In the courtroom, tensions escalated as the trial progressed. Mercer and Sanderson struggled under intense questioning from Jamal's legal team. Every answer, every hesitation, revealed the weight of their bias. Jamal's questions were precise, cutting through excuses, exposing uncomfortable truths. Detective Mercer, Jamal asked during cross-examination, would you have detained a white homeowner for watering their garden at 8 a.m.? Mercer's lips pressed thin. I don't know, he muttered, the answer betraying a flicker of awareness. That's right, Jamal said softly, almost under his breath, but loud enough for the jury. You don't know because you've never had to confront that bias before. But it exists, and it affected your actions. It affected my life. The tension in the room was electric. The jury shifted, leaning forward, absorbing every word. Jamal's calm authority, combined with the stark evidence of racial bias, was overwhelming. Even those skeptical before had to recognize the imbalance of power and injustice that had occurred. By midweek, Jamal introduced medical records and psychological testimony showing the impact of the detainment on him personally. The humiliation, the fear, the anxiety. This was no small matter. A man trained to navigate the law had experienced trauma at the hands of those sworn to protect. The emotional toll was visible even to the most detached observer. Outside the courtroom, protests were organized. Community leaders demanded the firing of Mercer and Sanderson. The city faced mounting pressure not only from local citizens but from civil rights organizations nationwide. Jamal's lawsuit was no longer just about his rights. It had become a rallying point, a demand for accountability, a public reckoning. As the trial neared the closing arguments, Jamal felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and determination. The fight was not over, but the momentum was on his side. The jury had seen the evidence. They had heard the testimony. They had witnessed the racial undertones, the misconduct, the humiliation, and the fear. Mercer and Sanderson, once confident and commanding on Jamal's driveway, were now quiet, defensive, and under scrutiny. Their authority had crumbled under the weight of proof, and the courtroom had become a battlefield where truth, justice, and accountability were colliding in real time. And through it all, Jamal's resolve never wavered. This was bigger than one detainment, bigger than one driveway. This was about exposing systemic bias, demanding accountability, and reclaiming dignity, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been treated unjustly because of the color of their skin. The stage was set for the climactic finale, the jury's deliberation, the city's response, and the resolution that would shock the nation. Jamal knew the fight was almost over, but he also knew the echoes of this battle would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. The courtroom was silent, the kind of tense, electric quiet that makes every breath feel loud. Jamal Everett sat at the front, composed but alert, his hands folded neatly. Today was the day the jury would deliver its verdict. Weeks of testimony, evidence, and intense scrutiny had led to this moment. Every detail of that morning, the handcuffs, the driveway, the racial undertones, the humiliation, was on display in the minds of 12 ordinary people tasked with making a historic decision. The foreperson of the jury stood. Jamal's pulse quickened, but he maintained his calm exterior. Mercer and Sanderson, once authoritative and unshakable, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The weight of accountability had landed squarely on them. The foreperson cleared their throat. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Jamal Everett. A ripple ran through the courtroom. Cameras flashed, gasps echoed. Some people whispered with disbelief. Jamal felt a surge of vindication, a release of the tension he had carried for weeks. Justice, at least for this moment, had been served. The judge banged the gavel, signaling the conclusion of the trial. The room erupted with murmurs, congratulations, and tears from supporters who had followed the story closely. Outside, crowds of neighbors, civil rights activists, and reporters were waiting. The moment had gone beyond a single lawsuit. It was a statement to the community, the city, and the country. The city, recognizing the overwhelming evidence and public pressure, quickly entered negotiations for a settlement. Jamal's legal team made clear that this was not about money. It was about accountability, recognition, and systemic change. The final settlement was $2.8 million, a number that sent a clear message. Racial profiling, illegal detainment, and abuse of authority carried consequences, and society would no longer ignore them. Mercer and Sanderson faced disciplinary action, mandatory retraining, and public scrutiny. Their reputations were irreparably damaged. They had underestimated Jamal's resolve, his preparation, and his ability to turn personal trauma into legal leverage. But for Jamal, the victory was more than monetary. Walking back into his neighborhood, onto the driveway where it all began, he felt the sense of reclaiming. The familiar trees, the lawn he had tended for years, the quiet streets, all of it now symbolized resilience rather than fear. Neighbors came forward to shake his hand, apologize for what he had endured, and thank him for standing up not only for himself but for the entire community. Activists praised the trial as a turning point for local policing policies. Social media posts celebrated the outcome, framing Jamal's story as an example of courage, perseverance, and legal expertise overcoming systemic bias. For Jamal, the experience was both painful and empowering. The morning he was detained had been terrifying and humiliating. Yet, the trial, the evidence, and the settlement had transformed that trauma into something meaningful. He had demonstrated that standing firm in the face of injustice could effect real change. He also knew the fight wasn't over. One case did not erase decades of systemic problems, but the impact was immediate. The city announced new training programs for law enforcement, focused on racial bias, community interaction, and constitutional rights. Policies were revised to prevent detainments without cause, and for the first time, many officers and citizens in the area had to confront uncomfortable truths about assumptions and prejudice. Jamal returned to his office that evening, exhausted but resolute. Calls from colleagues, friends, and activists flooded in, praising his courage. Yet, in the quiet of his office, he reflected on the personal cost. The fear that morning, the humiliation, the anger that had burned inside him. But even in that reflection, there was clarity. He had used every ounce of that experience to fight back. The $2.8 million settlement was significant, yes, but for Jamal, the real victory was intangible. It was the acknowledgement that he had been wrong, the validation of his dignity, and the demonstration that the law could protect those who knew how to wield it, even when the system initially turned against them. Months later, Jamal walked through his neighborhood, greeted by familiar faces and children playing in the streets. The memory of that morning remained, but it no longer carried the same weight of fear. Now it carried empowerment, proof that standing for justice could reverberate far beyond a single driveway. And while some would always argue that what happened to him was rare or isolated, Jamal knew the truth. The experience was a reflection of a broader reality, a systemic pattern. But by standing firm, by meticulously preparing and documenting every detail, he had carved out a victory that sent a message. Injustice could be confronted, bias could be challenged, and accountability was possible. The officers involved, once symbols of unchecked authority, were now cautionary examples. The city had changed procedures. The neighborhood had witnessed history unfold on their very streets. And Jamal, once just another resident, had become a figure whose courage and legal skill had shifted the balance. As the sun set behind his home, casting long shadows across the driveway, Jamal took a deep breath. The morning that had started with fear and humiliation had ended in justice and reclamation. He smiled faintly, knowing that while the struggle against bias and inequality continued, he had won a battle that would echo far beyond his own life. The driveway, once a stage of humiliation, was now a symbol of resilience, proof that standing firm in the face of injustice could indeed change the world.